All right, checking back in here on this notion of philosophy as attempting to harmonize thinking with itself in a process that always fails. The discourse of philosophy, like all discourses, is leaky. There's always something that's dropping out from it that's fundamentally missing, that renders that big other lacking. And the trick is to find where this lack is signified. Hence the famous signifier of lack in the big other that you see in the upper left-hand quadrant of the graph of desire. And we're going to focus here briefly on this important paragraph in the middle of page 3, where Lacan really zeroes in on this, if only to let us know once more that the unconscious is truly the object field of psychoanalysis. A rule of thinking that has to guarantee itself from non-thinking as being that which may be its cause. This is what we are confronted with in the notion of the unconscious. So you heard me in our series on Seminar 14 dip back into Lacan's critique of Descartes, which I assume you're probably pretty familiar with at this point. You can review that, holler at me if you need access to those materials, and I'll do what I can. It's only in the measure of the beyond sense of remarks and not as is imagined and as the whole of phenomenology supposes from sense that I am as thinking. My thinking cannot be regulated, whether one adds or not, alas, as I wish. It is regulated. Now, the most important part of this, the really new element that Lacan is introducing here is it is regulated, which is going to connect in the next paragraph with his statement, it is reigning. But for now, let's just focus on this notion of connecting philosophy with an attempt to harmonize thinking with itself. And what Lacan is here saying is that that harmony can't happen. There's always some cacophonous, discontinuous element that interferes in this process. And I think what we could say, agreeing with Alain Badiou here, is that philosophy is always caught in this dialectic between sense and nonsense, meaning and absurdity. Which is it? Coherence, incoherence. Philosophy is always working and trying to figure out and monitor the boundaries between sense and nonsense. And Badiou does a really good job in his lectures on Lacan of pointing out that there's a third element here. It's not just 1 + 1 = philosophy here. It's not just sense and nonsense. It's something is left behind by the disjunction between sense and nonsense, between knowledge and the unknowable, if you want to play it that way. This is neither sense nor nonsense, but what Badiou rightly refers to as absense. Ab meaning off, away from. Absence, though, is not nonsense. And I think Badiou is precisely right. This is a very important distinction to note. Absence is the disjunction, or what's left of the disjunction between sense and nonsense, that is the very basis for the discourse of philosophy. So the discourse of philosophy, in other words, would suggest that if it can just wrap its brain around knowledge and the unknowable, sense and nonsense, that it will have a totalizing account, what Lacan earlier here on page 2 suggests, a vision of the world. And what's missing from that, though, is the very disjunction, the very relationship between, or the non-relationship between knowledge and the unknowable, sense and nonsense. And this is a third element. The relationship between sense and nonsense, the differential relationship between them that philosophy establishes, maintains, and monitors, that differential relationship is a third element that philosophers are oftentimes ignorant of. It is something that is absent in the discourse of philosophy. This disjunction between sense and nonsense that is absent from their discourse, known as philosophy, Lacan refers to it on page 3 as a kind of intersense, something between sense, if you will. Now, he could be playing with the close relationship between sense and essence, interest. That's also at work here. Absence, nonsense. The sense part of this has its etymology in the verb esse, meaning to be. So just hold that in mind as we're messing with this here, because as you've heard me say, probably more than you prefer, there is an ontology of psychoanalysis, and it is a meontology because it deals with non-being, with a field of experience that is off and away from being, that is absent from the discourse of being, known as ontology. Ontos, being, logos, discourse about. Absent from the discourse of being, absent from ontology, is this other field. And this is going to be the field of psychoanalysis, the field of non-being, of meontology. That's kind of what Lacan is getting at here with the notion of intersense on page 3. This is something that he says is beyond sense. And I don't know if I like that as much as absense in Badiou's reading of this and texts following this period in Lacan's thought. If you like your Lacanian terms, this would be something that is extimate, something that is exterior to and intimate to the discourse of philosophy. It's a hole, if you will, in the discourse of philosophy that allows philosophy to operate. In fact, that's the important part here about Lacan's use of set theory, Lacan's understanding of containers, or in keeping with this discussion, discourses. The hole in discourse that renders it leaky, the same way that a waste bin can have a hole or crack in it, or a bag can have a hole in it, is not actually a subtraction of the value of the waste bin or the basket, but instead the very basis for its meaning, for its value. It doesn't mean it makes it more functional. It just means that the dysfunctional aspect of every totalizing operation is precisely what allows it to continue and perpetuate itself as a totalizing operation. This is why Badiou is the great inheritor of Lacanian thought, I believe, in part, because he fundamentally understands that the state, although it purports to seek a totalizing count of every entity in the world and so on and so forth, it works and sustains itself only by ensuring at a structural, logical level that that count is always incomplete. Because if the count were ever complete, there'd be no need for the state as a counting operation to do its thing. So there's always something more to be counted. And that's why in the field of identity politics that is so endemic to our world today, you have to be very careful about what you ask for. Is representation of your identity group exactly what you want? I can tell you it's exactly what the state wants you to want. It absolutely wants you to want to be uncounted but subject to the count that is its operation. So here we are working with this notion of discourse as a counting mechanism, pushing it in Badiou's direction. What Lacan's going to say again and again is that there is this structural, logical inoperativity, a slippage of sorts, something that's constantly falling out from the process. If indeed it's this attempt in philosophical discourse to harmonize thinking with itself, what we can see is that the monkey wrench in this system is going to be the unconscious. Because we know that it's precisely where I think I'm thinking that I damn sure am not. And it's in fact where I don't think I'm thinking at the level of the body, at the level of the unconscious, that all of my greatest thoughts truly occur. So Lacan's going to turn this philosophical system on its head, but he's looking for this notion of the unconscious here as something that would be the cause and condition of possibility for thought itself. That's what he's doing on page 3. And we're moving fast and loose here because this is in anticipation of what we're going to be up to in the series, and just getting folks acquainted with the first few pages of this seminar, which are pretty damn daunting.